Okay, we're going to go over the notes for our cell section in science. So where I was able to, I went ahead and added some extra information. Just remember, you only have to copy the notes that appear on the handouts that you already have, but I will continue to tell you extra information that you can do with it what you will. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to help you understand the basic difference between cells. So you're going to have, what we're going to do is we're going to label plant cells. Now in 7th grade you will expand upon this information. Mostly you will begin to understand why it is that all these parts are inside of the cells. But for now, I would just like to define a few of them just so you don't show up to 7th grade and not have any idea of what's going on. Starting with number one. Number one is what's called cytoplasm. Cytoplasm exists inside of a cell. It's kind of a clearish, almost semi-liquid material that helps move stuff around the cell. Number two is a vacuole. Vacuole's main function inside of a cell is as storage. So it would help to think of it as almost like a closet or a box of some kind that holds material for the cell. In a plant cell, the vacuole is typically used to store water, so it does tend to be a lot larger than other organelles inside the cell. Number three is the nucleus. Since this particular cell has a nucleus, it's classified as eukaryotic. And remember, the nucleus is just the control center for the cell, controls most of the functions that occur inside the cell. Number four is mitochondria. Mitochondria's main function in the cell is to provide energy for other parts of the cell to use. Number five is what is known as chloroplast. Chloroplast is what allows plant cells to undergo photosynthesis. So it's these organelles that are responsible for assisting the cell by converting sunlight into usable energy so that it can produce its own food. Number six is a cell wall. Plants cells, almost all of them have cell walls, and even some bacteria have cell walls. Cell wall's main function is to provide support for the cell and to also assist with holding in moisture and protecting plant cells. And number seven is cell membrane. The cell membrane also helps to control what comes in and out of a plant cell. And you'll notice on the diagram how the cell membrane is within the cell wall on a plant cell. So it gives it almost like double protection. Animal cells. Okay, now moving on to an animal cell. Now you're going to notice some similarities between animal cells as far as the organelles that are inside of an animal cell. There are some that are also inside of a plant cell. Starting with number one, mitochondria. So animal cells have the same organelle mitochondria as plant cells do. They also perform the same functions. Mitochondria provides energy for the cell to use. We also see at number two, animal cells have a cell membrane, just like a plant cell. But you'll notice that animal cells lack a cell wall. As I mentioned before, cell walls are particular to plant cells and some bacteria only. So animal cells don't have cell walls. Number three is the nucleus. So both plant cells and animal cells have nuclei, which makes both plant cells and animal cells eukaryotic. Number four is a vacuole. You'll notice just like a plant cell, animal cells also have vacuole. But unlike a plant cell, animal cell vacuoles are much smaller. But they serve the same function in that they're used for storage of different materials. And number 5 is cytoplasm. Again, also appears in plant cells. Serves the same function. It helps in moving around organelle inside the cell and helps the cell to maintain its overall shape. Drawings because it's not actually drawn on there, but it does exist inside of this nucleus. So the genetic material would be inside. And then we're going to do a single prokaryotic cell. This one just happens to be a bacteria. Okay, and as a bonus, we are going to quickly label a prokaryotic cell. Now, I did not give you a copy of a prokaryotic cell for your journal, so you're going to have to draw this one in. Fortunately for you, though, this is a fairly straightforward drawing, really simple, and one of the first things you'll notice is that prokaryotic cells, specifically this bacteria, they don't have a lot of organelles inside of them. So you might want to pause this video and just sketch in what you see right here, and then I'll proceed with the labels. Okay, so hopefully you paused and drew this in, so let's go ahead and start identifying what these things are. So you'll notice that the prokaryotic cell has both a cell membrane and a cell wall. So these are both seen on this diagram. Most prokaryotic cells and some eukaryotic cells have like these little hair-like long hairs coming off of them that are used for moving around. Those are called flagellum. You can also have a different type of moving hair that's called cilia, but this particular type has flagellum, which are the much longer hairs. What it does is it kind of whips out behind the cell and causes it to move around as it moves back and forth. You'll notice that inside the prokaryotic cell there's a series of little dots. Those little dots are what are called ribosomes. Now ribosomes also exist in both plant and animal cells as well. We just didn't label them in our particular diagram, but their main job is to provide proteins for the cell. Proteins, not to get too much into detail, but those are involved in helping cells carry out a lot of the procedures that they do. A lot of the things that they do on a day-to-day basis are based around whether or not they can create and maintain these proteins. Okay, and the last organelle, you'll notice I had to draw that in rather quickly, but you can just draw some little squiggles inside of your prokaryotic cell, and that's supposed to represent the DNA or the genetic material that's inside the cells. Now prokaryotic cells, they just have their genetic material just kind of floating around wherever it needs to go, anywhere inside the cell, whereas in plant and animal cells, the DNA or genetic material is stored inside of the nucleus. So that's why you didn't see it. In a prokaryotic cell, this genetic material just kind of floats around the inside. This is important when it becomes time for the cell to want to make copies of himself. It would be able to do that and make copies of itself. Okay, so just a quick word on size and shape. So you'll notice here, if this is the animal cell and this is the plant cell, you'll notice that they have different exterior shapes. Plant cells tend to be more cubic, kind of box-like with straight edges somewhere on the cells, whereas animal cells tend to be more globular, more roundish. Now when you're talking about sizes, usually animal cells and plant cells, they're roughly the same size. But remember, both of these cells are eukaryotic, meaning contained somewhere inside those cells you will have a nucleus. Now a prokaryotic cell, if I was to draw it to size, you'll notice that prokaryotic cells are much smaller. So this little thing right here would be a prokaryotic cell, sized in relation to an animal cell and a plant cell. And when you think about it, it kind of does make sense because a prokaryotic cell has to be small enough to enter a eukaryotic cell. So it kind of makes sense that bacteria and viruses would be smaller than a plant or animal cell. Okay, for our compare and contrast Venn diagram, I went ahead and just gave it to you all at once. So the majority of this information contained here, here, and here. This is just a collection of organelles that exist within each cell. So on this side, these are the organelles that exist only in plants, and then over here, these are the organelles that exist only in animal cells. And then right here in the middle, these are the organelles that exist in both. And as I've mentioned already, both of these cells are both eukaryotic. So I've mentioned this before, when you get to 7th grade, biology really kind of expands on a lot of what we're touching on. Mostly the majority of these organelles that are listed here, you're going to be responsible for knowing what they look like and what their job is inside the cell. But for now, 6th grade, you just kind of need to know the nucleus controls the cell, cell membrane is the outside of the cell, controls what comes in, comes out. Cell wall, kind of the same job, only found in plant cells and some bacteria. And pretty much that's it. Everything else above and beyond that would just kind of be bonus to know at this point, but just be ready for it in 7th grade. Okay, so now what we're going to do is compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So if you glued these in your journal correctly, then this should appear on the outside. So there's really nothing to write on here, but when you flip the page over, the illustration, you'll notice like some hairs that are around the outside of. You should see this, and so this is where the majority of your notes are going to go. Okay, let's start with the characteristics of a prokaryotic cell. So, prokaryotic cells, they look like they have some kind of tail, which I've discussed is called the flagellum. It's used mostly to help the organism move around. It does not have very many organelles inside of it. So if you remember, prokaryotic cells are a very simple form of life, very basic. So they don't require a lot of organelles inside of them to perform their functions. They have no nucleus, which is one of the defining features of being prokaryotic. There is no nucleus. And you'll notice in the illustration right here, organism, those are called cilia, used primarily for the same function of mobility, being able to let the cell move around. Eukaryotic cells are more round than prokaryotics. They also tend to have more organelles, which are the little organs inside of each cell. And unlike prokaryotic, eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. Both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are similar in that they both have membranes around them, meaning they both have a layer that goes around the outside, protects it, and allows certain stuff in and out. They both have organelles inside of them, those little organs, and they're both microscopic, meaning they both can't be seen unless you have a microscope. Finally, let's answer some questions about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So the first question for prokaryotic is asking, does the cell have a membrane-bound nucleus? Now when it says membrane, it means like a cell membrane, so like a layer of fat cells basically, or fat molecules that wrap around the nucleus. So does a prokaryotic cell have a membrane-bound nucleus? The answer is no. The next question asks, where is the DNA found? And the answer to that one is floating freely inside the cell. As we discussed and as I drew on the previous picture, the DNA or the genetic material for a prokaryotic cell floats freely inside the cell. So it's not in any particular location, it pretty much floats wherever it wants. Examples of this type of cell include bacteria, and I want you to go ahead and add another example, another organism which is like a bacteria, but these are called archaea. Archaea are a separate type of prokaryotic organism that we're going to discuss actually in our next chapter, because they make up a wholly different domain of organisms that are similar to bacteria, but they are special in some ways. Very, very prehistoric organisms. Look like bacteria, but they're not bacteria. And the last question is asking, are they multicellular or are they unicellular? Meaning, are they made of many cells or are they made of a single cell? And all prokaryotic cells are unicellular. And let's make this slightly bigger so that way it's easier to copy. You can go ahead and pause it at this point. I really should have done this from the beginning, but I just realized that I can do this. So pause it here if you need to copy it, and then we'll move on to eukaryotic. Now for eukaryotic cells, very similar questions. Again, this is just an attempt to differentiate between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So starting with, does the cell have a membrane-bound nucleus? The answer to that one is yes. It does have a membrane-bound nucleus. Where is the DNA found? Well, the DNA is found inside the nucleus. So this is compared to a prokaryotic cell. In a prokaryotic cell, the DNA is found floating wherever it wants, but in a eukaryotic cell, the DNA is found within the nucleus. So it's actually stored inside of there, like a container. Now, as far as eukaryotic cell examples, there are a bunch, but we'll just stick to plant and animal cells. Plant and animal cells are both eukaryotic, meaning their cells do have a nucleus. And there are other examples, but we're just going to stop there because I don't want you to fill in this space with too much notes, or too many notes. And then finally, the last question, multicellular or unicellular? So these are both multicellular and unicellular. So what that means is there are some organisms in the eukaryotic category that are multicellular, made of many cells, and then there are some also that are unicellular. So there are examples for both. So multicellular and unicellular. So right there. Okay, I believe that is the end of our notes. Of course, you can always go back, hear it again. If anything that you might have missed, when you're done, move on to the next assignment. Thanks.